now and sort of give you the quick overview. We are less than 2 months away. November 5th will be the elections here in the United States, of which we'll be deciding who the next president of the United States will be. 32 members of the US Senate out of 100, and all 435 members of the House of Representatives, and then a large number of governors and the state elections as well. It's just an extravaganza of voting, right? This is the big one. And I will say, sitting here in Washington and having done this, been around it my entire life, I'm a fifth generation Washingtonian. Politics has been in the family all that time. My father ended up working on Capitol Hill in Congress for 30 years after he got out of the Marine Corps, for Senator Danny Inouye from Hawaii. So Asia Pacific was always a huge focus more broadly. And my grandfather did the same. He was a lobbyist, etc. I say that because this is the most confusing election cycle I have ever seen. And I've been looking at these elections, as I said, for forever. We have, of course, President Biden, who got taken out. His own party forced him out from running for re-election. We've never seen that before in American history that I'm aware of. Kamala Harris, vice president, who did not have a lot of attention or focus internally in the United States. She was sort of a quiet, person in terms of speeches and certainly policy perspective, is now the nominee. And Donald Trump is back, of course. And are we less than a month and a half, so less than 2 months? We're in a dead heat. This race is too close to call, and it is broken down into key states. Let me just walk through that quickly. If you really want to watch and try and get a handle as you're doing your own research on this election, watch what's happening in Pennsylvania, watch Wisconsin, and watch Michigan. Those are the three most critical states, and they will decide who the next president of the United States will be. Other critical states, a second tier, North Carolina and Georgia. Pennsylvania, if either candidate loses Pennsylvania, they're going to have a hard time getting elected as president. Let me just sort of weave into this Vietnam. In the United States, there are 2 million, estimated, a little over 2 million citizens of Vietnamese descent, either direct migration to the United States or the children of. They make up 8% of the total Asian Pacific population, if you will, that is in the United States. Okay, well, it's not huge. Let me go back to Pennsylvania. There are more than 50,000 Vietnamese living in Pennsylvania. The Vietnamese vote in Pennsylvania actually really matters. I think this is one of the reasons that Kamala Harris, as vice president, who did not travel a lot overseas, has been to Vietnam twice in the last 4 years. That's one of the reasons. There's a bigger strategic reason, which all of us will discuss as well. But as I said, I think this race is too close to call. The polls are sort of showing this all within 1 or 2 percentage points. Neither candidate that I see in any of the key battleground states are over the magical 50% yet. For those of you who are following it, I would discourage you from looking at national polls. They really don't matter. They give you something of a barometer, but they really don't matter. It's, again, the key battleground states of Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and then I'd throw in there North Carolina, Georgia, and maybe Nevada. President Trump, I would argue this, my personal view, ever since the assassination attempt, the first one, has not been the same. He seems somewhat distracted. His campaigning has not, I have seen it's not follows sort of a rigorous, disciplined momentum. You would think he would just be in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin constantly. Instead, he was campaigning in New York yesterday. Why? Nobody can figure out, because he's not going to win New York. It's too much of a Democratic state. He did pick his vice presidential choice, J.D. Vance, from Ohio, because J.D. is of those people. He appeals to the Wisconsin people in Wisconsin, the people in Pennsylvania, people in Michigan. And for those people, if you haven't spent time in those states, there's a very large blue collar working class element. And that J.D. Vance appeals to a lot of them. He wrote a best-selling novel that turned into a movie, Hillbilly Elegy, because he grew up in very rural parts of Kentucky and Ohio, very, very poor, where it's decimated by drugs and fentanyl and et cetera. So he appeals. But Kamala Harris picked Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, another Midwestern common guy. Neither of them, I would say, are particularly wealthy, though I think actually J.D. Vance became wealthy from his book, but he wasn't before. Walz isn't either. So this is a battle for the Midwest of the United States. Let me just quickly turn to the other things to keep in mind here. Harris has raised an extraordinary amount of money for her campaign, a shocking amount of money for somebody who came in so late. Trump is behind her on that, but he can make that up because he's got his own money. So in terms of the campaign, in some ways, it almost feels like we haven't gotten into the full sprint yet. They're running faster and faster, but we're not in the full sprint yet. Now, by comparison, 4 years ago, 8 years ago, 12 years ago, we have our president's election every 4 years. At this point, you'd feel like it was a full-on sprint. Right now, no. And part of that is, I think, just the changing environment of voters, where their attention span doesn't last very long. And so it's whoever gets there last. But I would also say this: voters, and this is showing up in polling, they already know Donald Trump. You either love him or you hate him. There's really no middle ground. And if you love him, you're going to vote for him. And you know what he stands for because you saw it during his presidency. Harris has been very careful about what she says and what she believes on a number of issues, particularly on fracking for natural gas and oil, something that she opposed in 2020 when she was running for president in 2020. Now she says she's in favor of fracking. Tax views that she's had, that she has shifted, but she doesn't want to get out there and get very specific on policy issues. And the reason for that, and I've had conversations with senior Harris campaign staffers, when you make a policy position, as they say to me, that you create a target, and that target gets put on your back, right? In terms of you have to defend it, you have to push it. If you don't say anything, then you're not going to screw anything up. It'll be okay. So she's been elusive that way. And this just goes to one of the more extraordinary things in the campaign. She really hasn't sat for any media interviews since she was chosen as the presidential nominee. She has sat for 2 of them, which were kind of very easy, no hard questions. But she hasn't sat down for major media grilling, if you will. And it's been 52 days of this, and that's extraordinary. But she's been very deft, very, very, very smart in running the campaign so far. Let me quickly turn to the issue of what else is going on, because from a trade and tax perspective, it's all about who wins control of the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. I'd say at this point, it's 50-50 odds that Republicans hold on to control of the House of Representatives. And it may be beginning to lean a little bit the Democrats win control of the House. We have a very divided government here when you get to the congressional level, right? The Republicans have a 3-seat majority in the House of Representatives. Democrats only have a few seat majority in the Senate. I could see at this point and would predict that we're going to see the House of Representatives flip to the Democrats, and in the Senate, it's going to flip to the Republicans, believe it or not. Just an inverse of what we've seen now. Congress tends to stay out of trade matters. They don't make trade policy so much. It's pretty much the president. So it's going to really matter who is the president, whether it's Trump or Harris. And we can talk about that with Trump and his threat of tariffs, massive tariffs on everybody. The tax bill will be a big issue because we have a major rewrite of the U.S. tax code, which impacts both individual and corporate, domestic and international taxes. Most of those tax provisions were passed in 2017 when Trump was president, but they expire in 2025, 2026, and have to be rewritten. With the US deficit being where it is at this point, and which is in a terrible position, and also some of our entitlement, our social safety nets, our social security program, our Medicare program, on a trajectory to be bankrupt within the next 8 years or less. This is sort of a perfect storm that Congress is going to have to deal with in the next 2 years. How are you going to pay for all of this? That's going to be very problematic. And how do you do it that you don't create a recessionary situation? It's going to be very tough for whoever is sitting in the White House and whichever party is in power. Let me move quickly to the Trump and tariffs, because I know this is of grave concern to countries everywhere. There's two ways to look at this. Trump could do this. I think he won't. He could just out of the box immediately get elected and just sign an order putting tariffs on all major trading partners. But I'm of the view, in talking to his campaign staff, that Trump is being a CEO. He is putting out the hardest line verbally. And he's basically saying, I'm going to put 200% tariffs on China and the European Union. Okay, well, if he gets elected, you can imagine every country that is most exposed and most at risk are immediately going to start talking to him and negotiating, right? So this may be more of a negotiating tactic than anything else. I also do believe that he is coming to the realization that if he does actually slap tariffs on everybody, it will have a very serious negative impact on the economy in the US and probably even globally. So I wouldn't be overly concerned over the tariff issue, but let's see how that plays out. Tom, I gotta jump in though, and where's the future of the US Vietnamese Vietnam relationship? Because I think this is really actually quite exciting. That's why I was so happy when you asked me to do this.
Can I ask you, can I interrupt for a second? You know, what really was confusing to me recently was the fact that Vietnam was turned down for the market economy status. And, you know, even though, you know, we took that by step and just moved on locally here, there was at least some consensus that felt like that was in the bag, given the momentum of the relationship between the U.S. and Vietnam. Did you get any color from that being on the ground?
Yes, and I'm going to compare it to something else that is particularly of interest to the region. I think a lot of this was driven by the fact that if that had happened, there would have been some sort of impact to industry in the U.S. that would have been negative, and particularly to certain unions in the U.S. The unions in the U.S. have historically been Democratic. And virtually every union here has endorsed Kamala Harris for president, except one very large one, our Teamsters, truck drivers. They're not endorsing anybody. And that's the first time in, I don't know, 60, 70 years that they haven't endorsed a candidate. The reason being is that the union leadership across the board, the auto workers, the steel worker leadership support Biden and Harris. The rank and file majority of them are supporting Trump. So this is Biden is fighting to make sure that he keeps the union vote, right? And going into this November election and knowing. So, for example, the Teamsters that I mentioned, one of the largest unions here, announced today that they're not going to do the endorsement. They did an internal poll, and 58% of their members are voting for Trump. Wow. The steel workers, the same thing. And here's the analogy, Tom. If you've been tracking from a market perspective, Nippon Steel's bid to buy U.S. Steel, and Biden saying he's going to block it. But he has no grounds to block it. There are no national security concerns. There are no antitrust concerns. He's just doing it because all of the steel workers in Western Pennsylvania are going to be absolutely critical in this election. It was for himself and now for Harris. He announced 2 weeks ago that they were going to block that deal. that there was imminent, that there was going to be the executive order from the president, and then it didn't happen. And now I have information that the U.S. Steelworker chief has threatened the White House with withdrawing his endorsement of Biden and threatening to endorse Trump, who also has been in opposition to the deal. I use that as a surrogate case because it's very much, I believe, exactly what happened here with Vietnam. Meaning, I can easily see sometime this spring or summer of 2025, we suddenly revisit this and it's approved because the elections are behind us. I think it was a very political move.
Thank you very much. And you were entering the part about Vietnam and U.S. relations.
Oh, look, I think this is a very interesting time in the U.S., I think, because the U.S. always is sort of transforming itself in one way or the other. If Harris wins, and I do think that she's gaining momentum here, right? It's neck and neck, very tied, but she seems to have some slight momentum over Trump. But let's just assume for a moment she wins. This will be our first Asian president, right? She's half Indian. She's got relatives in India. She has focused on the Indo-Pacific as a vice president. She, as I mentioned, she has been to Vietnam twice. That's extraordinary. But I think there's so much more here, and we're going to hear from our friends more on this in detail. But the U.S. sees Vietnam as a tremendous business partner, right? It is seen as a place for nearshoring of where the U.S. can help build out semiconductor manufacturing, moving, and that will be very interesting, right? I mean, certainly we've seen shoes, footwear, more basics. This is moving higher in the technology field. And you see how and I think it'll be very interesting to watch from a market perspective over the next 10 days to 2 weeks, because we're coming up to the UN General Assembly meetings, right? And this is where all the heads of state come in and they make their speech in front of the entire UN itself. But there's the importance of it is all of the bilateral meetings that are taking place on the side. And I am hearing increasingly loud whispers that President Biden is probably going to meet with General Secretary Tu Lam next week, and that is, considering all the heads of government who want to see the President of the United States, that they want to make a priority of that. But it goes to the relationship between Vietnam and the U.S. that has been elevated certainly over the last 4 years, right? I mean, we're at a all new high now in terms of that we have a comprehensive strategic partnership. That's the technical phrase, right? The highest level diplomatic relationship with Vietnam, and something that has also happened between Vietnam and Australia, India, Japan, South Korea. Those don't happen in a vacuum. All those other countries are talking with the US and with each other about this. And they're all talking about the simple fact that Vietnam is going to be, and very imminently so, a major economic engine in the Indo-Pacific, more than it is already, right? And it has everything going for it. On top of it, you've got a tremendous, it's 2 million Vietnamese here in the United States. That may not be a lot, but considering the influence that Vietnamese Americans are beginning to exert in industry and commerce, here in Virginia, I live just outside of Washington, D.C., about 20 miles. The Republican candidate is Vietnamese, graduated from the Naval Academy, was a U.S. Navy SEAL for years, and he's a force of politics here. Stephanie Murphy, a congresswoman I know from Florida, is now, she then retired. She's a big force in Democratic politics. You're beginning to see the Vietnamese Americans playing more of a role in politics here in the U.S. And I don't think it's by coincidence. We're moving into an Asia century. We're into it deep already. We're not moving into it, we're deep. And Vietnam is critical to it. And for the United States, in terms of commerce, mutual security for the entire region so that we're peaceful and prosperous, I think this is just going to continue to grow. And one last thing is, let's remember too that we just had you just had the Vietnamese defense minister here meeting with the U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. That was a love fest. That was a lot. You would have thought these are the two greatest of allies, and I think that's really where the U.S. wants to go. Last thing I'd say is, when Austin became Secretary of Defense, what's the first country he went to? He didn't go to Belgium for NATO. He didn't go to Canada. Our first place he went, Vietnam.
As we say in Vietnam, "Trời ơi," is, "Oh my Lord," this is amazing, Frank, and your commentary is just amazing. And I could sit and listen to you for hours. But we have other speakers, so I would like to transition. Obviously, we'll come back to you with some questions, okay? So the next speaker, let's focus on the U.S. economy and global economy, Derek. And again, let me make just quick comments about Derek. I've known Derek for over 20 years. Derek actually started his career as an economist at a very, very prestigious firm in the U.S., Waddell & Reed, Ivy Funds, who eventually morphed into Macquarie. Macquarie is a global powerhouse asset manager, runs about 350 billion AUM. Derek is a senior economist and perhaps more importantly to me, a wonderful friend. Thanks for being here, Derek, and tell us all the great news that we're seeing reflected in the marketplace.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I appreciate it. I thought maybe it would be helpful if I would give just, and I want to leave plenty of time for some Q&A. So let's start with the U.S. economy. You know, it's funny that Frank used the term that this is the most confusing election cycle he's ever seen, and I was thinking the same thing about the economic statistics that we see in the U.S. I've been doing this for a long time, as you mentioned, and I can't think of a time where the economic data was as confusing and conflicting as it is now. Let me give you a couple of examples. So if you look at the, you know, whether it's surveys, if you look at earnings for large companies versus small companies, large companies are doing well. Small companies are really struggling right now. Another example, if you look at the surveys that we have for consumer confidence, consumers are really starting to say that they're increasingly worried about the labor market and the ability to find a job, but yet they continue to spend, right? And typically those things don't go in opposite directions. So it's been a very confusing time. Despite calls for a big slowdown, the U.S. economy continues to grow at a healthy pace. We've seen GDP growing around 3%. I believe that government spending is one of the main reasons that the economy has held up so well, just given the amount of interest rate increases that we have seen from the Federal Reserve. Typically, when the Federal Reserve raises interest rates as much as they have, they've raised over 5 percentage points. That would typically result in a pretty meaningful slowdown in the U.S. economy and many times a recession. And we really haven't seen that. The economy has continued to grow at a very healthy pace. Now, I will say that we are starting to get some signs that maybe the economy is starting to slow somewhat. We're seeing employment growth starting to slow. Unemployment is beginning to rise, but it doesn't really seem like this is enough yet to cause a recession. Now, one of the big things that has been a positive to the overall environment and in particular the consumer is that we've seen inflation coming down in the US. So headline inflation peaked around 9% in 2022. It's currently at 2.5% right now. If you look at core inflation, which excludes the volatile food and energy sectors, it peaked around 6.5%, and it's currently just over 3%. So we've seen a lot of progress on the inflation front, and I think we'll see it continue to move lower from here. If you break out inflation between goods and services, goods prices have been falling for the past year, and I think that's going to continue to occur. Services prices, on the other hand, if you look at services inflation, that's been moving down at a much slower pace than what we've seen on goods. And I think we will continue to see services inflation move lower over the remainder of the year, but it's going to generally be much higher than what we've seen on the goods prices in terms of the inflation rate. And that brings us to interest rates, right? So the Federal Reserve on Wednesday They lowered interest rates by a half a percentage point, 50 basis points. They indicated that they plan to lower rates by a total of 2 percentage points by the end of 2025. So this was a pretty meaningful move by them, and was a somewhat surprise depending on who you ask. But I think they wanted to be aggressive and show that they are in front of this and don't want to fall behind if in fact the US economy is slowing. If you look at Europe, let's pivot a little bit. We've had a soft economy there. We had a mild recession several months back. We started to see the economies grow in Europe, but in general, it's been pretty weak growth. Globally, if you look at manufacturing, that's generally been weak. And so you see that bifurcation in European countries. Those with less manufacturing exposure have been doing better. Then countries like Germany have been lagging the rest of the Euro area. They have a very high exposure to manufacturing and exports, and that's really been a drag on them. And I do worry about the longer term competitiveness of the manufacturing sector in Germany, just given some of the headwinds that they face. And that would obviously benefit other manufacturing countries, and that would include, I think, Southeast Asia, as those countries in Southeast Asia, including Vietnam, continue to move up the value added chain, produce higher and higher quality and more technical goods, if you will. We've seen inflation coming down in Europe as well. That's going to continue, and I think that's going to result in lower rates in Europe as well. The European Central Bank has already cut rates twice. It's totaling a half a percentage point, and I think we continue to see rates come down over the course of the next year. Now, let's move to the all-important country of China, and I know a lot of people have interest in that. China, obviously, their economy continues to struggle. Consumption and investment are both soft. Property, though, is extremely weak, and that's where my focus is. We've seen exports looking kind of be a bright spot. They've been looking strong, but I wonder how long that can last, especially with the US potentially slowing down and Europe remaining soft. And so, like I said, I'm really focused on the property market and what that means for Chinese economic growth and the potential for recovery. And if you just look at the raw numbers directly, property accounts for roughly 12% of GDP in China. And it's actually much higher than that if you can include the secondary effects that occur once the ground is broken to start building property. But one of the areas that I'm more focused on is on the confidence impact for the households. Around 70% of household wealth is in the property sector in China. And we've seen property prices falling for 15 consecutive months. Now, if you are a consumer and the price of your largest asset continues to fall, you're very unlikely to increase your spending. And you see that in the data, the retail sales data that we get, the consumption data that we get continues to struggle. It's been rather soft. Consumer confidence levels are at record lows. And so I think stabilization of the property market is the key thing that we need to be watching in order to see a rebound in the overall economy. So I guess the bottom line I would leave you with, and then we can jump into questions a little bit later. Growth, I think, is slowing in the US. I think inflation and interest rates will continue to move lower. I do think that European growth is going to continue to be sluggish. And again, Chinese growth is soft, and it probably remains soft until the property market starts to improve. So why don't I turn it back to you, Tom?
Thank you so much, Derek. Thank you for all that. I do have just off the cuff question. And by the way, we do have questions, tons of questions coming in from listeners. So I'll try to ask some of those at the end of the event. But the thought in my mind is this commentary about the slowdown in the US. And my reaction to that, and I'm always biased. You know, my nickname on Wall Street is Tommy the Bull. I'm always bullish. But my bias then would come back to you and say, isn't the US supposed to slow? Isn't that what the Fed was trying to do for 11 rate increases? So yes, I know that we'll never know whether it's a soft or hard landing until we look backwards. But when I hear economists around the world talking about the slowdown in the US, this time around, I'm less concerned because I think it's almost by design. Am I too biased, Derek, in my view?
So I would say you're partially right, Tom. The Fed has what is called a dual mandate. So most central banks around the world have a single mandate and they focus on inflation. The Fed has a dual mandate, and that is price stability, so inflation, and then what they call maximum employment. And so having as many people employed as possible without it causing wages to shoot higher, which drives inflation higher, so on and so forth. And so when they started raising rates, remember, inflation was going crazy. And part of that was due to the supply chain issues that we were seeing across the globe. But they knew that there was a lot of stimulus that was injected into the economy from the government, and that they needed to try to bring inflation down because that stimulus was driving consumption higher at a time when supply chains were constrained. And so, yes, you're right that part of the reason they were raising rates was to slow the pace of consumption. And also, I would say, to bring more balance into the labor market, to try to slow the pace of employment increases because companies were unable to find workers and they were driving wages higher and higher. But the fundamental focus for them was on the inflation side. And the way that they get to that is by resulting in a weaker economy.
Great, Derek. We'll come back to you in a little bit with more questions and probably drill down a little bit on the 50 bips. Let's transition now. Let's take it home. Let's take it home back to Vietnam. We have the esteemed Tanwa Shinapa. Tanwa is actually a great partner to SSI Asset Management. Tanwa is a partner in one of our funds. The fund itself has outperformed the index by 35%. So, and I'm rounding numbers here, Tanwa, so don't yell at me. The fund Tanwa is a partner with is up 3%-ish year to date versus the index up around 10%. In my view, that's 2,000 basis points of outperformance. So with that, Rockstar, I'll turn it over to you to talk about how all this feeds into Vietnam.
Okay, sure thing. So in my opinion, I think this election is a very pivotal moment for both the global and for Vietnam itself. So I have been investing in Vietnam for over 10 years. We started in 2014. And the biggest reason is that Vietnam was the biggest beneficiary of the trade flow and the globalization in the world. So right now, Vietnam is exporting about 28% of the export is going into the US. So that is driven by the trade policy of the US, and that will be impacted by the election. But before we going into who will win, I think in both scenarios, Vietnam will turn out to be the beneficiary still, but it will be a different sector that benefit in each of the scenarios. The Vietnam investment story will still be there. The people is still there. The spirit of Vietnamese people is still there. The capital, the technology flow is still going to Vietnam. But what I observed over the past 10 years when I invest in Vietnam, actually in the first Trump presidency, he kickstarted the biggest trade rerouting from China into other countries. So what happened is four things. First is the trade dispersion. So the competition from other country besides China is going up because China is having a big tariff coming from Trump. So we are seeing that in electronics, apparel, footwear, and maybe furniture as well. That the Vietnamese brands start to grow very well in this sector. And then the second thing, the rerouting. So when the tariff is actually going up in the US, there is a big rerouting of product outside from China into other countries and into the US. We are seeing that a lot in Mexico and of course in Vietnam. So that benefit textile and electronics and partly solar cell as well. Okay. The third, the biggest benefit to Vietnam is the relocation. Because of the tariff going up, China is having a less competitive advantage than other countries in this region, and Vietnam as a big ally to the US, we are seeing a lot of relocation into Vietnam, and I expect that trend to continue to go. So that we are seeing Samsung, LG is coming in, Foxconn is coming in as well. And lastly, the fourth one is the competition from Chinese product itself. This is quite a negative for other countries in the region because when China is building this much capacity in the country and they cannot export into the US due to the tariff wall, they start to export to other countries. We're seeing this in Thailand and Vietnam. Mostly it's the commodity product. We are seeing steel. China steel is going everywhere. It's hitting the price of the steel all over the globe. Okay, including Vietnam as well. For Thailand specifically, we see the automotive sector getting hit by the Chinese EV. That's going everywhere. So what I'm saying is, let's start with Trump first. If Trump actually win, I think this trend will continue. There will be more manufacturing being pushed out of China and into other countries, Vietnam included. So electronics, textile, FDI, industrial estate would benefit from that trend. However, the risk is that Trump used to look at Vietnam as as a potential trade deficit that he needs to look at. I remember that when he left the office, he launched the investigation into Vietnam for the currency manipulation because of the big trade surplus with the US. But that investigation has ended already. So if there is a second Trump presidency, we expect a short-term boost to the economy, but we have to be aware of the risk as well. For Democrat, I think Democrat is more stable path, more multilateral and stable growth for the countries. So they are more focusing on the technology trade, right? The renewable sector, the sustainabilities. So those sectors will become very interesting in Vietnam. So Trump is going with the tariff policy to help with the trade flow, while the Democrat is more like the industrial policy. So they see that China is subsidizing their industry, so US will do the same as well with the CHIP Act. The problem is that with the CHIP Act, I think US is still lacking some of the high skilled labor that they need, and Vietnam can be able to provide that. Okay, so the beneficiary, of course, is going to be like company like FPT that is doing a very big digital trade with the US already, and for the Democrat, I think the sustainability is a very important part of that mandate. So we can see a lot of investment going into the renewable sector. But so the company like RE or GG or the company like that building wind farm and solar farm in Vietnam would benefit. But however, the risk for the Democrat victory is that the sustainability they also come with the improved labor standard and everything that Vietnam may need to adjust their standard to meet with the global Vietnam, because I think Vietnam can do that. So I think for me, in conclusion, for the prudent investor, we need to know how to position ourselves for each of the scenario that may happen in November 6th. In both scenario, I think the Vietnam story is to do, Thomas.
Thank you, Tanwa. Thank you for those insights. I do have a simple question for you, because
Yep.
moving from New York to Ho Chi Minh City and learning, I'm really on the learning curve about the region, about Southeast Asia. One thing that's really jumped at me is the obsession that Thai investors seem to have with Vietnam. Not only are they obsessed spiritually, but they're actually the flow coming in from Thailand to Vietnam, from my eyes, is quite meaningful. Can you just perspective on how Thai investors view Vietnam?
Yes, sure. So let me go back to my investment department at KKP. We have been set up since 2004. For the first 10 years, we only invest in Thailand. Because back then we got the government coming in and they boost the consumption of the private sector, consumption of the grassroots people. That is make the country growing very fast. So we enjoyed that for 10 years. But after 2014-15, there seems to be a shift in the growth trajectory of Thailand. Okay, the first thing is we don't have the people. The population is growing very slowly because we have babies right now, and our biggest industry is slowing down. Okay, we are focusing on automotive. We were focusing on electronic, which is hard disk drive. We were focusing on petrochem, and our gas is running out. So basically, the growth of Thailand has been slow for the past 10 years. So back then in 2014, we start to look at other countries in the region, and then we discovered Vietnam, and Vietnam exhibit the growth spirit that we have seen in Thailand for the past 20 years. Okay, so Vietnam is kind of like following Thailand footsteps, but maybe like 5 to 10 years behind. Okay, so Vietnam got it all. You have a lot of people, almost 100 million people. Most of those people are young, and then you guys are the first generation of the businessmen after the war, right? So the fighting spirit that is there. From Thai perspective, we are very home biased, and we are very close to the Chinese culture, and we can see that Vietnamese people is kind of like I don't want to make comparison, but it's kind of like the fighting spirit of the Chinese people in the 1990s. Okay, so we are seeing that, and all of the founder that I have met, they're like very growth focused, and they are the first mover in the industry, so they can gain like 30%, 50% market share in like 5 to 6 years, and that is make the investment in Vietnam very, very good for us. Okay, and Thailand, since we are very biased to Southeast Asia, we're seeing Vietnamese people as very close to Thai people. Okay, we have a very close relationship, and when we talk about Vietnam, everyone in Thailand knows about Vietnam. We know that Vietnam is highly competitive. We know that they are the up and comer in the Southeast Asia region, and of course, from our perspective, the Thai people are one of the first mover into Vietnam, because you guys are still a frontier market. We don't see a lot of European or US investor in Vietnam yet. So we are able to go there and invest in the best of the best companies before the US and the European money coming in. So that's why Vietnam is a very good investment target for Thailand. Even now, I think after the US election, Vietnam stands to benefit more than Thailand in that regard. Because Thailand, I think we are a little bit leaning to the Chinese, so but Vietnam is more, on the other side. So you guys stand to benefit more.
Amazing, and as you're speaking, and I'm thinking about your performance record, it reminds me that having moved from the developed markets, mainly U.S. markets, now to a frontier market. Active management makes a big difference in a market like ours. Given your performance, I mean, in the US, our performance, we're talking basis points. In Vietnam, our performance in our definition and in your example is hundreds, perhaps thousands of basis points difference. So that just tells you the opportunity in Vietnam if you frankly know what you're doing and if you know Tanua Shinapa. So thank you for your comments there. So, with that, I think those are the official comments we have. I'm quite overwhelmed with all the questions coming in. So how about I just do this simply by asking the panelists, first of all, do you have any questions for each other that we can maybe start with? And then I'll probably pepper in, as I usually do, with some questions from the crowds.
Well, Frank, I have one for you really quickly. You were talking about the importance of Pennsylvania, and one of the surprising things I think that Kamala Harris did was not choose the governor of Pennsylvania as her running mate. Do you think that's a big deal, a critical error? How would you think about that?
Yeah, this surprised a lot of people that he's a very popular governor of Pennsylvania. But it was interesting. There was a number of issues within the Democratic Party, to get sort of granular to this, that emerged. One, there's a significant voice within the Democratic Party, if you will, in support of the Palestinians and Gaza. The governor of Pennsylvania had been quite outspoken in his support. He is Jewish himself, in support of the Israeli government. So I think if she had picked him, she would have probably spent a week or two trying to defend him on that. That was clearly an issue. And I think she saw with the Tim Walz, somebody who might appeal a little bit more to Michigan and a little bit more to Wisconsin, all in all. Strategic error, could be. Well, one other aspect of this too, I'm just going to be so honest because Tom's always told me to lay it out there. His name is Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania. I think there was concern. He's such a good politician. He could outshine her as a candidate, meaning people would say, why did the Democratic Party go for her? Why is this Harris Shapiro? Shouldn't this be Shapiro Harris? And I think that was a worry too. He's a really gifted politician. And there was some unhappiness that she ended up getting this and not going through the primary process, and that there was too much baggage. But anyway, that's what I had heard.
Interesting.
Yeah, maybe can I have one question for Frank? So I think the biggest issue with Trump that everyone is afraid is the tariff, right? He mentioned the 60% tariff for China and maybe 10% tariff for everyone else. So do you think that it is possible for him to increase the tariff with the Congress being this divided?
He could. Tariffs are something the president has the ability to raise himself. You know, the interesting thing about the China threat, I'm not certain there's much more that the U.S. can or really wants to do to China in terms of tariffs. What's been interesting is to see how Trump put them into effect when he was president. Biden walked in as president. He didn't change anything. There were some more tariffs, as he's just done on electric vehicles and other a couple other things. By the way, you couldn't find a Chinese electric vehicle in the United States if you searched for the rest of your life because they don't exist here yet, right? Again, another political play trying to help the the auto manufacturers and Michigan, which is one of those three key states, right? So I do worry about that, but I'm less worried about China. And I do think, interestingly enough, that Trump has a working relationship with President Xi. I think there is mutual respect there. And I think, let's just be honest, beating up on China is something that seems to win political points, particularly in Congress. And also, I would say, from a presidential standpoint. But at the end of the day, they don't do anything. There's more bark than bite. I mean, TikTok is the exception to that. But and the banning of that, but that's not unique. I mean, Kenya's done it, India's done it, but in terms of beating up on China, in terms of trade issues, people like to talk a big game and then really never follow through. Let's see if that happens with Trump.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a question for you, Frank. Why is this election so close? It's frustrating, is that right? It's you tell me we have Trump who seems a bit lost. Obviously we see all his legal problems and so on. And then on the other side, you have Kamala, who supposedly has raised all this incredible money, and we don't really quite, And then of course she has Taylor Swift. I mean, should we be taking the Taylor Swift thing seriously? Number one. And number two is, this is a real question. Why are you and Derek telling me this one is so confusing? Is it that we have two candidates that are kind of blah, or are we missing something here?
I think there is an element of, oh, for Pete's sake, this is what we got to go with. This is, of all the potential people who could be president, we're back. It was bad enough when it was Biden and Trump. Right? Battle of the two old guys fighting over who gets Jell-O at the old age home. Please stop, right? Why can't we have some youth? Well, that now just happened with Harris. I mean, she's 59 years old, but nobody knows her and shouldn't be a little bit more experienced, and she's dodging the press, and this isn't making people happy. But the other side of this is the Trump supporters are people who are not happy with what has happened, certainly over the last 4 years. The illegal immigration situation, which is just a mind-blowing situation of millions of illegals coming in here from around the world through Mexico. I was in Mexico 3 months ago meeting with pension fund CIOs, and one of them took me to his window in Mexico City and said, "Look at all these illegals. These are Africans and Afghanis, and they're not from what you're Biden's ruining our country because we're the gateway. We don't want this." So they're angry at Biden about that, and they're angry with how his performance in Afghanistan that continues to haunt him. And there are and they don't like some of the economics, and they don't like a lot of the social policies that he has pursued. Okay, well, Harris can't get away from that, and quite frankly, Harris is to the left of Biden traditionally in some ways. So you got a lot of people back to those blue collar working class steel workers who tend to be religious, set in their ways. They don't like it, and they'd rather go with Trump. And they saw Trump. They may think of him as crazy. They may think of him as erratic. But what they loved about Trump was they knew where he stood on taxes, and the biggest thing, they saw him as an unleashed monster, if you will, on Washington and the Washington establishment, which they see as just self-enriching itself, not really caring about the average American. So let's vote him back in. And that's where we are.
Got it. I do want to bring it back to the subject at hand, which is Vietnam. And this question is directed towards Derek. Derek, I went into the rate decision, a couple of days ago, betting on 25 bips. And, the 50 bips surprised me. I was wrong and delighted me at the same time in terms of what it's doing to the market. Simplistically, if I'm sitting here in Vietnam as a corporate or even as an investor, but mainly just on the ground here in Vietnam, looking at things in the U.S. That's going to impact my business. 50 bips, loosening, borrow rates dropping, mortgage rates dropping, auto rates dropping. Can I simply just say that, assuming all else is equal, that the consumer in the U.S. will continue to spend, and the companies in the U.S. will continue to invest, or maybe accelerate their investing because of lower borrow costs, and therefore, sitting here in Vietnam, we'll sell more fish, we'll sell more of our products into the U.S. market. I'm being overly simplistic here, but I want to try to understand what 50 bips really means for us sitting here in Vietnam.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the 50 bips was more of a signal saying that we're ready to get going on rate cuts and we're serious about it. And, to be perfectly frank, I think the reason they did it is because the market was priced for more odds of a 50 basis point than a 25, and they didn't want to disappoint the market and come across as hawkish. So I think that was one of the reasons that they did that. But I would say that the bigger point is look at what they are saying on the projection side. They're basically saying that we're going to have a number of cuts over the next year and a half to 2 years. And to your point, that should, all else equal, mean that it's easier for consumers to afford big ticket items because the cost of capital is coming down. It's better for small businesses. I was talking about the dichotomy between large businesses versus small and how small businesses are depressed. One of the reasons that's the case is because large businesses were able to tap credit markets when interest rates were so low and borrowed a bunch of cash, and small businesses didn't have that option. Rates went through the roof and they're borrowing from the banks at higher and higher rates, and it's just more and more difficult for them to operate. So all else equal, it should help them. The other thing I would point out is that when the Fed lowers interest rates, it typically allows emerging markets, including Southeast Asia, to lower interest rates as well. And one of the main reasons that's the case, many emerging markets tend to follow the Fed loosely on interest rates because of they don't want their currency to have wild swings. And so when the Fed starts cutting rates, that gives the all clear to Southeast Asian countries to start cutting rates. And lo and behold, a country like Indonesia, who had said we may not be cutting rates until Q4, they cut the morning before the Fed, surprising the markets because it was becoming increasingly clear that the Fed was going to start cutting rates. So that I think that's one of the direct impacts. Or indirect impacts, I should say. So you have the direct impact from being able to sell more goods, but then the indirect impact of it allows interest rates in some of these other emerging countries to come down.
Got it. I think I'm going to upset a lot of people because I'm going to be closing out this call in respect to those who are in the US. That's getting late. I've always learned that in a great meal, I cut people off right before they get full, so that hopefully we have other calls like this. I am going to pick on one person. I'm going to pick on Frank. Okay, Frank, because
Always
you
did.
yeah, I know, I always do. I always do. So with all this confusion, all of these unknowns, who do you think wins? That's all. That's why we've spent an hour with you, Frank. That's all we want to know. So I'd love for you to just make a fun prediction. When you put all this madness into the blender, what do you think it spits out, Kamala or Trump?
I think Kamala.
Okay.
I think Kamala. She's holding on. She's building. You talked about Taylor Swift. That was a big endorsement because it got women and younger women who are huge fans of Swift moving over.
So am I, by the way. So am I.
You are a Swift. I knew you were. Look, he's trending that way, and people are a little tired. They may like Trump's policies, but they're tired of all the baggage of criminal cases and him saying stuff that they don't like. You know, why is he saying this? Why is he doing that? And I think that's going to be the problem. It's a suppressed vote, interestingly enough. People who would come out for Trump may not come out that day.
Yes.
Because he said something or he's done something. Whereas everybody who's in favor of Kamala, they're showing up, rain or shine, snow or wind.
Got it. So in closing, guys, look, I've said it over and over again. This business of ours, and many of us have been in it for quite a while, is all about people. It's all about relationships. It's all about insights. And many of us are privileged to get a chance to meet people like Frank and Derek and Tanwa along the way. And what you've done for SSI and for me is just I'm deeply grateful. This is really a series in many events that we're going to hold at SSI called Gateway to Vietnam. You guys are really at the beginning of this, and you are a gift to us. Thank you for enriching our clients, our partners, our employees, all the listeners with your insights. And hopefully we'll hear from you again soon. Okay. With that, thank you from SSI Securities, and thank you, and we'll talk to you soon. Cheers. Yeah.
Cheers.
Thank you very much. So we have the closing on the WebEx platform as well. So thank you for everything, and we really hope to see you sometime in Vietnam very soon.